Elise, thank you so much for joining us to discuss your very new book. I think it came out September, The Making of Felony Procedure in Middle English Literature. So can you start by briefly introducing yourself and telling us about your field of research?
So my name is Elise Wang, and I'm a medievalist, which means that we kind of have a lot of overlapping fields. I was just actually talking about this with a historian, but if you're a medievalist, you do some history and you do some literature, but you also do some archaeology and you do a lot of paleography, which is looking at old manuscripts and figuring out what they are. So there are a lot of sort of different fields that come in. But I was trained in a literature department with a history advisor. So it's kind of all over the place.
And, for those students in the audience or even people still finding their path, why did you decide to become an English professor?
That's a good question. I think I just wanted to keep on doing school, and that's how I ended up doing this, basically. But I ended up being a medievalist because of a great class that I took. And I loved all of the different skills and all of the different ways, and I felt like I would never get bored with the different ways of looking at things. So that's how I ended up being a medievalist.
Thank you. I'd like to start with some definitions to make sure that everyone in the audience knows the basic terms of this talk. So your book is titled The Making of Felony Procedure in Middle English Literature. Let's start with Middle English. What years does that cover?
Okay, so Middle English is a version of English. It's an early version of English, and it's between the Beowulf English and Shakespeare's English. So it runs from roughly, if you're including early Middle English, 1100 to 1500. And so that's sort of the period. It's quite different. If you've taken my Shakespeare class, or if you've taken my Chaucer class, then you know it is quite different than modern English. It has a different grammatical structure. So it both marks a period and a specific language.
And let's move on to the word felony. What is a felony?
Well, this is actually the basis of the book. So felony has never been defined. We don't ever define what a felony is. Not then and not now. A felony is vaguely a serious category of crime. But right now, the only way we define it is as a crime punishable by more than 1 year in prison. That's the only definition we have for it. So as you might imagine, that includes a sort of grab bag of crimes. It includes first-degree murder, but it also includes mail fraud, and lying on a variety of federal forms can also be a felony. So it includes a really wide variety of things because we only ever define it by how it's punished. And so in the medieval period, that was death and forfeiture of property. And the death part was optional, but the forfeiture of property was the main part of it. You always lost your property if you were convicted of a felony.
One may be surprised that this study is coming out of the field of literature, right? They might think, why aren't you in politics, administration, and justice? So why don't you tell the audience what we gain by approaching this question using the tools from your field?
So to kind of answer that question, you have to know how felony was prosecuted. So at this point, felony is it's prosecuted by the crown, which means that the king cares what the outcome is. But the king and his men are very busy. And also they have very little interest in crime. They think, and in their words, it is boring and distasteful. So all of the kind of prosecution, the procedure, so this is about felony procedure, all of the procedure is done by regular people. And so what happens when a crime is committed, say a body is found, whoever finds the body is someone who is designated the first finder, and they have a variety of legal responsibilities. And the first one is that they have to go out into the street and yell. So they raise something that's called the hue and cry. You have to run out into the street and yell until people come. And then once the people come, you tell them everything that you found. and you have to stay with the body until the coroner arrives. And then the coroner comes, and the coroner is hired by the Crown, but the people who do all the investigating, who figure everything out, are just neighbors. They're just the people who happen to be there. And they figure out what they think happened, and then they tell the coroner, and he writes it down. And so at each step of the felony procedure, it's really run by ordinary people. And these people don't have any legal training. They don't have any more legal training than you and I do. They have to figure out for themselves, what role should physical evidence play in this? You know that, like, if you find John dead, Robert and John have had a tiff going back and forth for weeks. You know they've been at each other's throats. Might be Robert, but maybe there's no physical evidence. Or, the bloody knife is found elsewhere. So how do you weigh those against each other? How do you figure out how to build your own system of evidence and procedure and guilt from the ground up? And I think the argument of the book is that the way that they did that was by turning to cultural touchstones that they knew, like poetry and sermons and other things that discussed guilt and evidence in more accessible ways. And so that's why I think it's kind of the only way we can come at what they were thinking. We have the written sort of part of felony is very small. There's very little writing about felony in any sort of, in the statutes, in the legal treatises, in textbooks. There's very little writing about it because all of it happened on the ground with the people who had to deal with a dead body in their midst.
And I'm so in awe of the research you had to do to reconstruct this. And I don't want that to be lost on the audience. I'm an early American historian, so even the 17th and 18th century, it's difficult to reconstruct. Like, you want to get to like these basic facts.
Yes.
So I can't even imagine how you were doing this. So can you share with the audience like that process, the sources you do resurrect, you rely on to recreate not only the procedure, but the culture around these questions of guilt and evidence?
Yeah, so a really good example is one of the cases that I use in the book. So most of my sources are from the National Archive in London. They are usually very short cases. So you get, like 4 lines about someone's death, and that's it. You don't get anything else. And usually you can't find another case related to it. So you might only have one document. And from there, you kind of have to unravel what you think might have happened. So an example is, Alice is dead. Alice was found dead. Her husband, Robert, is nowhere to be found. The neighbors say that Alice and Robert had a fight in the solar, in the upper room of their house, and that he had struck her with a staff and she fell down the stairs and died. So they're telling this story to the coroner. So this is from the coroner's report. So the coroner gets that far, and then he says, but then it's found that the son, also Robert, has been locked up in the jail for his stepmother's death. And so the coroner calls another jury and is like, so actually what really happened here? And they say, well, okay, both men were involved, but it really was the father who knocked her down the stairs. And then at the very end, there's a line that says, the body was examined and it was found that she died from the blow and not from the fall. So you have to think here about the social story of what's going on. Because these are jurors who are all neighbors to these people, and they're speaking to an outsider. They're speaking to this representative of the Crown. So there's no saying that what they're telling him is correct. And in fact, they have their story straight at the beginning, that it's the father. And conveniently, he's gone. But then it turns out they've arrested the son. And so the question is, was there actually reason to suspect the son in the first place? Did they actually think it was the son and then they locked him up? Was it actually the son and they wanted the father or the father decided to take the fall? There are a lot of different ways this could go. And that's kind of all the information we have about it. I can think of a variety of options, but those are just a few. And I think this can be supplemented by something like St. Erkenwald is a poem about finding a dead body, basically. But it gives a blow-by-blow of what happens when you find a dead body. It talks about the hue and cry. It talks about the neighbors going around and interviewing people. And you see that there's actually usually 3 or 4 days before their coroner shows up. So a lot can happen in those days in between. And so when you're thinking about Alice and Robert, you could imagine a situation, maybe he's known to be abusive. Maybe this is a long-standing problem. And he does finally kill her and they drive him out of town. Maybe he's a powerful man and so they don't actually want to kill him, but they drive him out of town. And so that by the time the coroner arrives, he's nowhere to be found. Or maybe the son really was responsible for the death. And by the father fleeing, they've put it to rest and the son is able to stay. So there are sort of a variety of kind of like little maneuverings that you can guess at in this story. But that's basically what I do, is I look at these stories and I try to figure out what I think actually happened.
And, one of the things you capture so well in your book is that kind of trustworthiness, reputation, this question, as you laid out, there's so many different stories and interpretations. And a lot of this comes down to who is trusted and why. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So if you think about it, if this is our little community here and I end up dead, then the only way, how do you go about investigating that? Well, the first thing you would want to know is what people knew about me and who was close to me and who might have had some sort of argument with me. And you don't do that by physical evidence. You don't do that by forensics. You do that by talking to people. And you sort of get a sense of, okay, she was this kind of person. She had these kinds of relationships. This relationship was complicated. Maybe we should look at that. That is actually the most intuitive way to go about investigating a case in a small community. And so reputation and trustworthiness were really the main currency in investigating criminal cases, because that's where you were likely to get your best information. On the other hand, reputation is not always in your control, and it's not always earned, and it's not always relevant to the case. And so I think there has been a sort of impression among scholars that reputation played a kind of deciding role in every case. And I don't think that was always true. I think one of the arguments I make in the book is that they were aware that reputation and gossip and things like this were corruptible, that talk could be toxic, and that this wasn't always going to give you the best information. And so there was an awareness that this wasn't always the best way to go about things. So it was something they were always trying to balance.
I don't have this. I'm going to spring a question on you, but I really, you have a chapter in there. It's towards the end, but it's almost about, in this system, this one piece of autonomy that people who are accused have is to not plea. Yes. I hope that's the right term. Yeah. I haven't. Yeah. And I found that fascinating and wanted to give the audience a chance to hear that argument.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is just something I came to sort of towards the end. So there's a procedure in felony procedure. This is the jury trial at this point. So this is the beginning of the jury trial, the jury that we know now, except that it tended to be drawn from people you would know rather than anonymous people, because those are the people who would know, right? Those are the people who would know. If you ended up dead, the people closest to you are the ones who would know. And so that's who the jury was drawn from. But it was kind of a new procedure, and so they wanted to shore up the authority, and so they would ask people permission to try them in this way, and most people said yes. But occasionally, something you could do to resist this was to just say nothing. When you were called to the bar to plead, you could say nothing. It was called standing mute, and you were allowed to do this. But then the legal system was in a little bit of a pickle because they couldn't try you, but they also weren't just going to acquit you. And so they ended up using various methods to coerce you into pleading, like starvation or pressing you under heavy stones. And so it ended up being a moment of struggle between the person who was called up and the legal system. And this could go on for a long time. There's one woman who was pardoned after 40 days for having stood mute for 40 days. And she is starved in prison for 40 days and nights. And she ends up being pardoned by the king, basically because they can't figure out what else to do with her. And so it's a moment in the legal system that opens up where you have this ability to resist the whole process and bring it to a halt, because if you didn't consent to it, then you couldn't be tried and it couldn't go on. And so in the book, in the last chapter, I look at a few women who did this. So for men, it was a way you could keep your property. So in that way, it's a little more clear, because if you weren't tried and you weren't divested of your property, then your sons could inherit. So there was kind of a reason for doing it in the case of men. In the case of women, they were not allowed to inherit and they were not allowed to pass down property. So why would they do this? And it was sort of a rare moment when they could make a statement and have the floor, basically. And so I look at a couple women who are accused of killing their husbands, basically. And just sort of what we can glean about what they meant by doing that.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
This next question might push some academics out of their comfort zone, but I know that you think about public scholarship and you think about the impact of what we write as academics. So I want you to talk about how this book makes you think about criminal procedure, felony procedure now, and how we're defining it. We define it, as you said before, we're still in a moment of flux.
Yeah. Well, I think we pride ourselves on a very rule-bound and procedural legal system, and I think that is very important because rule of law is the only way to ensure fairness. Felony is one place where we keep on resisting rule of law. We just will not define it, and I think, especially in the current moment, that's really striking, that we've decided not to define this most serious crime. We punish people with death for felonies, and we still won't define what it is. And it seems to me a sort of perverse resistance that I was really interested in. I actually explored this a little in the epilogue, and then I'm writing another article on it. And I think that we are invested in preserving this kind of hazy villain-felon association because it allows us to exercise these feelings of revenge and vengeance on evil doing in our society. We want, I think, despite the fact that I don't think anyone would talk about it this way in the legal profession, I think we kind of leave felony undefined because it serves us. It allows us to preserve this space for kind of an emotional reaction to people that we really are going to preclude them from society forever. Because felony, as you may know, comes with a lot of collateral consequences. It comes with things like permanent disenfranchisement. It can come with things like termination of parental rights and grounds for divorce. It can come with things like being barred from licensing for a variety of professions for the rest of your life. So it is a way that we remove people from our society. And yet we refuse to define it. And I think those things are related. We want to preserve this idea that law is about removing villains from our society. And felony allows us to do that.
Thank you. All right, final question. You are the recipient of the very prestigious Carnegie Fellowship for your next project. So tell us what it is. What is the next project?
Well, you're all going to be very sorry that I talked about felony because the next project is about conspiracy theories. And so that's what everybody wants to hear about. I'm writing about the narrative genre of conspiracy theories from the medieval period to the present. I do think that there is a genre that we have not yet defined. Conspiracy theories, we usually talk about the believer. We talk about who believes, why do they believe, how do we make them stop? That's always an included question. How do we make them stop? But we don't really talk about the fact that there are also stories You know, they are things that have their own narrative rules. They are a genre. If you hear a conspiracy theory, you know what it is, right? You're like, yes, that's a conspiracy theory. We all have this instinct for conspiracy theories in the same way that we have for fairy tales and romances and detective novels. We all recognize the genre, but we haven't really characterized it. So that's what the book is.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing both about your new book and your next project. And we can't wait to have you on with your next book. Thank you. Isn't that the cutest thing? Yeah. Thank you. I am now going to invite up, also from the Department of English, Literature, and Languages,